State retirees may be paying more for health care, and legislative scholarships may be on the way out. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state government, sometimes the federal government, and how it just might affect your life. I'm Bernard Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. Legislature came and went again for another week, and here to help me talk about that, Kevin McDermott is back from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. He's the State House Bureau Chief. Welcome, Kevin.
Hi, Bernie.
And Kent Redfield, Professor Emeritus, that's a fancy word for, but he's still very busy, of Political Science at the University of Illinois, Springfield. Kent, welcome back.
Good to be here.
Pensions are in the news, and well, Kent, we'll have to ask you first about this. I know you're still active and working on many projects, but as a retired from the state person, you would know about this. There seems to be some legislative momentum building for a plan that would take away, basically, I think it's free health care other than some copays for state retirees from here on out, and Speaker Madigan is now behind this. And so where are we going with this? Because I know some state employee retirees are upset.
Well, the health care benefit is created by statute and funded out of the General Revenue Fund. So if you're a 20-year retiree, if you're a retiree that's 20 or more years of service, you're supposed to pay nothing for health care. But that can be taken away just by changing the state law. There's not a constitutional issue. And so the Speaker and Minority Leader Cross have an amendment to a bill that I assume is now out on the floor that would do that. And this probably is leverage in terms of the bigger pension debate, because the governor's pension proposal was using the prospect of employee health care, of keeping it as the carrot in terms of agreeing to some reduced benefits or increased contributions. So it doesn't seem logical that you could use it as a carrot and also abolish it, but it becomes one more thing in the dance. But it certainly makes a lot of retirees pretty nervous if what they were assuming was the situation suddenly goes away. It's a hit in your monthly budget. There's no question about it.
I know that the main union that many state employees belong to, AFSCME, was upset about this. They had a press conference. I was not there, but there were apparently several retirees who were complaining about this. Kevin, any thoughts on the probability of massive change like this occurring at this time of budget crisis?
This is less massive change than what they're talking about. I think that's Kent's point about leverage. And I think you're going to see a lot of that and a lot of nibbling around the edges. I mean, the problem obviously with pension reform is that they're limited in what they can do, or at least one thought is that they're limited in what they can do by the Constitution. They can't just yank this from them. They have to get them to agree to it. I think you're seeing something along the same lines in terms of nibbling around the edges when you get the constitutional amendment that they put on the ballot.
Right, and this,
which
I assume the governor has to sign that, but I'm sure he will.
Yeah, I think that's right. But you know, in that case, that would make it more difficult for the legislature to do this unwise thing they've done in the past, where they allow these pension sweeteners. They allow people to boost their pensions with additional.
Right. So it would now take an extraordinary majority under the constitutional amendment on the ballot. So
there's almost a sense of, you know, the pension problem is so huge and it's so difficult to deal with, and we have to look like we're doing something, or try and do something, or do something around the edges, or get some kind of leverage so that we can work with the union on this. I think that's what we're seeing in these different proposals.
Yeah. There was a study done last year, and a bill that was in the Senate that would have essentially prorated retiree health care, so that the more years you had in and the lower your pension, the less you would pay, or if you were at a certain level of pension on an annual basis, then you would pay 100% of your health care. And so, Madigan was talking about abolishing the whole thing, and then Cross, after the fact, said, well, you know, we probably would prorate it and not take go after people with very small pensions and stuff. So
Right.
it all is part of this dance of whether they can, the Democrats feel tremendous pressure to pass something before the November election. And if it's a deal with ASME, then that maybe allows you to put off dealing with downstate teachers until the veto session. So it's going to be, I think, fascinating. But from an individual retirees' standpoint, this is all very distressing, and they don't understand that we may be playing games and leveraging stuff, and some things real and some things aren't real.
Right.
Well, it's hard to explain to them. We, as Democrats, they don't want to see that press release from Republicans that says you did absolutely nothing on pensions.
Right, because the state's budget hole is such a big deal. And of course, the pension problem, as you mentioned, Kent, the constitutional provision that says once you get a pension benefit, it can't be taken away. Again, health care is now considered beyond that, but pensions have to be paid, pension obligations have to be met, and people have differing interpretations. Right. As we know, there are questions then if you can change your basic pension benefit from here forward for current employees or if only new employees. So still struggling with it at the State House. The other big issue that the governor continues to deal with is Medicaid, where he wants to make $2.7 billion in cuts. You have providers that have been very upset. You have the proposal for a $1 increase in the cigarette tax, with basically I think Republicans have said, no, that would not be a cut, that would be a tax increase. We don't want to do it. And Quinn says it would help health. Cigarettes going to cost more, or is that not happening, or any predictions, gentlemen?
I wouldn't make a prediction on that one. I think he's serious about it, but I'm not sure that's something that's realistically going to get through. And if it does, there's always debate about whether that kind of sin tax really brings in what it's supposed to, because in theory you're going to drive down the smoking rates anyway. But it is interesting how everybody wants to solve the problem, but they all want to solve it on different backs. You've got the Democrats saying cut the provider rates, don't cut
which is
people,
doctors and hospitals.
Which is doctors and hospitals. Mm-hmm. Don't cut eligibility for people. And you've got Republicans saying no, don't cut the doctors and hospitals, cut eligibility and make it tougher to get on. Quinn's plan, in fairness to him, would do both, which some would say that's what compromise is called.
And there is there's also kind of an administrative efficiency, waste and fraud dimension to this. And so when we talk about managed care, the idea is that administratively there may be some savings there. But, if somebody's going to get hurt, and as opposed to pensions, regardless of what we do on reform, we're going to make the same pension payment this year. It's not going to reduce the pension payment. So it doesn't affect the budget. But if we poke $1 billion hole in the budget by not getting the target figure on Medicaid, then we have to get it somewhere else. So the Medicaid cuts are real in terms of this year's budget. Pension reform is not real in terms of this year's budget. And in fact, you will have no way of knowing in November whether what they passed is either constitutional or good public policy. They'll just be able to say, I voted for pension reform. Whereas if you cut eligibility for Medicaid, then there are going to be people, real people out there not getting services that everybody's going to see. Or if you don't deal with Medicaid, then you got less money for schools or whatever.
Difficult choices all. Speaking of difficult choices, just as part of the ongoing budget problem, the governor has announced this year, as he has announced before in some of these cases, that he wanted to close some state facilities. They include the Jacksonville Developmental Center and prisons in Tams, our highest security prison, and in Dwight, which is the only, I think, dedicated women's prison in the state. And then the Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability, correct me, that's it, right? Made up of legislators met, and once again they said, bad idea, right, Kevin?
They said they did.
And of course, that goes along with a lot of these places
decisions
have
they didn't,
Republican legislators who are very budget hawks. But
right.
There are reasons to keep these facilities open. I'm not saying it. I guess you would expect local legislators to say that.
It's kind of telling. First of all, COGFA, the acronym, the ridiculous acronym for that committee, is this is an advisory. In theory, is an advisory opinion. However, in practice, it's always been followed. I'm not sure. There may be exceptions in the past, but it's not something you usually see. Usually, when COGFA says, no, we don't agree with the plan on this, that's a signal for everybody to sit down and come to some kind of compromise that they can agree on. When they voted one after another against the governor's plans on closing these places, he put out a statement a few hours later which seemed to strongly indicate that he was willing to ignore them on this and to do it over their heads, which sets up an interesting, it's getting tougher and tougher, and maybe that's what they needed to hear, and maybe that lets them off the hook. I don't think that what you saw in that room would qualify as courage by most standards, because like you say, most of these people are
Did anybody vote to close?
There were some split votes. Some of them were, and I don't remember off the top of my head what they weren't all the same. I think there may have been a few unanimous votes, but there were some split votes. But you're right. I mean, everybody, almost without exception, the legislature has been saying we have to find savings somewhere. We have to spend less money, and here's this plan in front of them, and they can't even agree on an advisory agreement with the governor on closing these places.
And you're going to have some, this is partially past policies coming home to roost. We probably have too many people in prison. We have used prisons as downstate economic development. Used to be, 40 years ago, you couldn't give away a prison. Then we had competitions for who got a prison. And so, it is, it's symptomatic of the whole budget process. And if you can fight the good fight and let the governor, who's not up for re-election for 2 more years, kind of wear the jacket for the bad decision, then that may be in fact what happens. If this is not leverage, and it does not appear to be the governor's trying to leverage this for something else, then if not this, then where else? I mean, that's what it comes down to.
Very difficult decisions. No, I remember in the Jim Thompson years in particular, when we had new laws, Class X laws, that and everybody in the legislature almost wanted to get tougher and tougher on crime, and they kept building prisons. I remember there was a mayor of Flora, Illinois, who actually did a rap song that made national TV. Is we is or is we isn't going to get ourselves a prison?
Yes.
And they didn't, but it made national news because I was with the AP at the time, and I remember writing about it back in the late 80s. Things really have changed because all of these institutions, things come and go. I mentioned legislative scholarships as the show opened, and this is an issue. Again, it's not going to save the state's budget, but there's been so much abuse. People are so mad at legislators in general, and then there have been abuses over the years. Legislators get to give like 8 full semesters a year, like 2 years worth of scholarships to state colleges or universities each year. And some of them have used them to help kids who otherwise wouldn't get to school. The schools have to eat the cost, but some of them have given them to the kids of their political supporters or their legislative aides and secretaries.
And it's a perennial scandal. I mean, every year
so now,
could come out.
After the certain newspapers have been screaming for years about this, all of a sudden Senate President John Cullerton says it's time to go, and the Senate has taken action to remove them. Is it real this time? Because usually each house passes their bill to abolish it. They don't match up and nothing happens, because then they can all take credit and still give out the scholarships.
It's real this time. Too much has been said about this. There's been too much public agreement about it. The governor's basically running a victory lap already on the thing. It would be, it doesn't have the feel of game playing. It has the feel of being real. And I think a lot of it comes down to not the money, not the thirst for ethics reform, but kind of frustration over having to deal with this every year. I think Cullerton said it best on the floor today. This is a distraction that they see again and again and again every year.
It's just become a self-inflicted wound that isn't worth sustaining. And now I think the details again may be that the effective date will allow legislators to make one more round of awards before the fall semester starts. And we should also note that while this is called a scholarship program, it is in fact a tuition waiver.
Right.
And
there are no requirements for getting any kind of grades.
The only requirement is you have to live in the district, and they've even flouted that requirement.
Yes. And there's no appropriation that goes with this. When say my University of Illinois Springfield, gets a student with a General Assembly scholarship, then we absorb the cost of that. There's no appropriation. It is it is a tuition waiver that is the cost of which is borne by the universities. And so the universities, while we love to have paying students, and so there'll be some. This will not be something the universities.
Is it getting less and less fun to be a legislator? I'm not saying that.
This was a great perk. You can send a kid to college. I mean, right. even the ones who weren't abusing it, this really was something of value to them, and that's why I think a small handful, only 5 voted against this in the Senate. A small handful were still standing behind this, but
right.
It really has become almost indefensible. I mean, you can't. When you've got the universities are struggling like this, what Kent just talked about with the way they've got this funded, or rather don't have it funded, it has allowed supporters of this to actually describe it as a cost-free way of sending kids to college. Well, it's not cost-free. It's only cost-free to them.
It's shifting costs to the other students.
And it's the other students, it's the other kids in that class that are ultimately having to pay for this.
Yeah, Senator Iris Martinez of Chicago put out a statement. She thought it was bad to do away with this because she's been able to help some kids who otherwise wouldn't get to go to college, she said. Governor's view, many people's view is, we have programs that provide scholarships based on merit and grades and need, and plug into those and do it that way.
And I've never heard a response to that from the people who support this. Just not that I'm impugning their motives or anything, but I've never heard anybody answer that fact that there are other programs that do in fact impose some kind of need and or merit to this. It isn't just whoever the politician thinks should have it.
Interesting. Speaking of bad publicity for legislators, Derek Smith is still a member of the legislature. He's been accused of taking a bribe in a sting situation set up in Chicago by apparently a federal mole who claimed to be from a daycare center and said, here, take the $7,000, write a letter so he can get a grant. He's still in. Legislature is basically on hold at this point from dealing with this situation because the U.S. Attorney's Office apparently is continuing to investigate and doesn't want to give any information.
They tried to edge their way into it, and they got a sort of I think must have been a humiliating letter that they read in front of the whole room, which essentially said, "Keep your nose out of this." Is what they heard from the feds. So it sounds like they're going to do that for the moment.
Interesting. I'm going to shift gears to a federal side a little, and I'm probably more involved in this story than you guys. But Tim Johnson is the United States representative from Urbana. The new map, is the new 13th district. He was running hard in that during the primary. He won the nomination for another term, and then he announced that after 44 years in government, he doesn't want to stay.
I wasn't in this too because it's Metro East now too.
That's right.
Yeah,
well, it's a very, very interesting situation. So we have Dr. David Gill, who is an emergency room physician from Bloomington, is the Democratic nominee, who has some quite liberal positions, like a form of national health care that he calls enhanced Medicare for all. He's going to push that, which may be a difficult sell in Central Illinois, but he is passionate about it and women's rights and such things. Whereas the Republicans are in this situation where they now have the 14 Republican county chairmen are going to make the decision as to who will replace Tim Johnson on the ballot. There's been a lot of infighting. Tim Johnson's former chief of staff, Jerry Clark, had a press conference the day after Johnson's announcement, family brochure, the whole thing, and ended up Johnson later, because it looked like he was working too closely with him, Johnson came out and said, I don't think my former staff member should be involved in this either. Right. And then Clark said, I respectfully disagree, through his spokesman. And they all used to work for Lee Daniels in the House, said, I'm in. And now there are 8 candidates who have applied, and within a few weeks we might know who the candidate is. Among other people in the running are Rodney Davis, who is one of the top legislative aides to John Shimkus, the congressman, and he lives in Taylorville, and Erica Harold, who now lives in Chicago but comes from Urbana and is the 2003 Miss America, which adds a little national pizzazz to it if the chairmen go that way. Kevin, who do the Republicans or Democrats benefit from this at all?
Well, you can't call this a win for the Republicans at any level. I mean, this was a seat that was theirs that they didn't even have to think about, and now all of a sudden you've got the Democrats unified under one candidate and the Republicans running around smacking each other. And the story that came out that you did it and I did it, and there was a radio station that did it about the former staffer that you mentioned.
Jerry Clark.
Yeah, Jerry Clark, and it comes out that he
his
had actually been
website.
setting this up beforehand, and it made it look like some kind of collusion. I mean, this kind of stuff
They
hurts
claim they
when
just
they're-
set up a website for his campaign because they were waiting for Johnson to retire.
It was a
next
patently
year.
unbelievable claim, but we can talk about that later. But
You're so much more bold than I am in public. Kevin.
But you know, I mean, Kent, you know, is the expert on these elective things. But it seems to me that if you're a Republican, finding a silver lining here is going to be a little difficult.
Yeah, I think it's you want to have your best field out there, and clearly if Johnson had said, I'm not going to run, then you would have had a very different group of people running in the primary, and somebody would have come out of that with the momentum towards the election, and now the Republicans don't even know who that person is. We've been through this before. Lane Evans retired after winning the primary, and I think back then it involved precinct committeemen rather than
precinct
county
committeemen
chairman,
had to
and so
cast votes.
we changed the law, but so now instead of 300 people, we have 14 people
in this particular district.
and there are some questions about how the weighted vote is being allocated in terms of whether it's just how many people voted in that.
I think it's how many people voted in the Republican primary in each of these counties in the 13th district in March, in the March primary.
Yeah, I that's the way it certainly should be, but I think, surprise, surprise, there's some ambiguity in Illinois election law, which we
it's
put out
always
one
complicated
fire
when
and
stuff happens,
put something else out, and here we go again. And so I'm not sure what the solution is, but clearly this did not work well with the Republicans when they replaced
Jack Ryan.
Jack Ryan look for a candidate
with
to run against
with
Brock.
Alan Keyes, who they
Yeah.
brought in from out of state. That was perhaps the goofiest decision I've seen a state party make since I've been covering this stuff. And they know they don't want to do it that way.
Yes.
And interestingly, Pat Brady, who is the state Republican chairman, because the current state central committee is based on the old congressional lines, so there's no real state central committee person solely in the new 13th.
Yeah.
So Pat Brady just said, I will be neutral and I will oversee this process. So he's bringing together the 14 new county chairs to meet, and they might by the mid-May make their decision on who this is going to be. And I'm sure they will try to coalesce. The new 13th is supposed to be either slightly Democratic leaning or 50-50, I think, whereas Tim Johnson's old district, where this Democratic candidate, Dr. Gill, ran against him 3 times, was like 70% Republican.
Yeah.
So
Those are
the Democrats think
Republicans
they have.
Democrats run.
What's interesting is, you check your inbox as a reporter these days, which we get stuff from everybody, but the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee, NRCC, National Republican Campaign Committee, I think that's the one, has now been sending out missives almost daily saying how Dr. Gill, because he likes Obamacare, will hurt you.
Right.
So both parties are going to target this race with a lot of money, and it's going to be one of the several in Illinois.
Yeah, and that's worth that side of it's also, if it would have been an open seat, you might have had candidates other than the 2 Democrats that ran on the Democratic side. And while it may on paper be a neutral district, it's going to take the right kind of Democrat, just like Representative Costello, when he retired, that district is Democratic if you've got the right kind of Democrat.
Right.
And so it would have been a different dynamic in both primaries. if
Yeah,
Johnson
and Kevin, are you familiar with that 12th district down there? Because Jason Plummer is the Republican candidate. He's that very tall young man who ran for lieutenant governor, and his family owns RP Lumber stores around the state.
That's how we're identifying him in stories from now on, that tall young man. Okay.
Well, I always
is
tell
a very
Jason
tall
I
young
look
man.
up to him. I think he's 6'8". But is that considered a 50-50 district as well?
I think it is now. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and as Kent said, when Costello was in there, it was a safe seat. It wasn't going anywhere. But it's not a naturally Democratic district. It's a downstate Democratic district, which is a very
Pro-gun.
complicated thing these days. Yeah,
Yeah.
you have to be a social conservative Democrat, which is hard to walk that line.
Right.
And it's what you have here is a kind of a party old timer in Harriman, a local party guy. Versus this young
His first
guy,
name is Brad?
Brad Harriman, right? And this young guy who made something of a name for himself as a lieutenant governor.
Yeah. Well, he won a multi-field primary.
Right. But I think most people would still consider him kind of untested. So it's going to be interesting. I wouldn't call that would be the one that I wouldn't call for anything at this point.
That'll be interesting to watch from afar. We talked about constitutional amendments, and there was one that people have been pushing for some years, which would combine the comptroller and treasurer offices, but only 3 constitutional amendments can end up on the ballot, and now we have like this one to make it harder to improve pension benefits for anyone, which is kind of window dressing because, it feels good, but it may not, most pension changes passed overwhelmingly anyway.
Yeah.
So is that lost for this year, the idea to combine those 2 offices, which both Republicans in those offices say we should do?
I'm not sure it's lost because of that. I think it's lost because House Speaker Madigan has decided he doesn't want, he thinks it's a bad idea and he doesn't even want to debate it. It hasn't even come to the floor. The Republicans have been making quite a bit of noise about this. Madigan's spokesman this week raised kind of an interesting defense of his, this long-standing argument that it's a bad idea to have all of the state's fiscal operations under one officer. He's pointing to Dixon, Illinois, where we have this single fiscal officer for the little town of Dixon, who's been accused of embezzling something like $53 million
Isn't that amazing?
over 23 years. It's an amazing
She bought a lot of horses.
story.
She's a horse person.
A horse empire, it sounded like. Yeah. But they point to this and they say this is the result of one person in charge of finances. Is that a realistic argument in this case? I don't know, but it certainly is a dramatic one.
Interesting.
Yeah, and no one remembers the original reason we have a comptroller and a treasurer, which was the Orville Hodge scandal back before the 1970 Constitution.
Who stole $1 million some and was auditor of public accounts, which we no longer have. And then they established the other offices. We are just about out of time. I should say that we heard late in the week that United States Senator Mark Kirk went home to continue recuperating after his time in the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago. So that's good news. We wish him well. They did release a picture of him a couple weeks ago, and looks like he's on the mend, so you can hope from the stroke he had. So Kevin McDermott and Kent Redfield, thanks for being here, your help. Thank you for being here. I'm Bernard Schoenburg, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.